Most of the conversations that exhaust you don't fail because you explain poorly. They fail because you are speaking to someone who cannot think at the level of the idea you're re-bringing. And the moment you truly accept this, something inside you relaxes. There is a very specific moment when this becomes obvious. You explain something important. Not complex for ego, important. The person nods, agrees, seems present. 3 minutes later, they act as if nothing was said. This isn't misunderstanding. It's a limit, not a moral failure, a cognitive one. The mistake isn't lack of clarity. The mistake is expecting thought where only repetition exists. Most people do not reason. They react. They respond to tone, not substance. They follow authority, not logic. They protect beliefs they never chose and cannot examine. When you don't see this, you internalize the friction. You try to explain better, softer, simpler. You assume the gap is effort. It isn't. Arthur Schopenhauer understood this long before psychology gave it names. He observed that most people are not accessible to reason, only to belief. Not because they are evil, because they are limited. This realization isn't meant to make you arrogant. It's meant to make you precise. Maturity begins when you stop demanding depth from shallow containers. When you stop pouring energy into interactions that were never designed to hold it. If this perspective resonates with you, staying here is already a decision. Subscribing isn't about supporting the channel. It's about committing to a different way of seeing and conserving your own mind. This video isn't here to put you above anyone. It's here to take you out of a position of constant friction. Because the real shock isn't that people don't think like you. The real shock is realizing how long you've been asking them to do something they were never capable of doing. What you are encountering isn't a personal failure of others, and it isn't bad character. It's structure, biology, psychology, and social conditioning working together. The human brain was not designed to seek truth. It was designed to ensure survival. For most of human history, independent thinking was dangerous. Questioning the group meant exclusion. Exclusion meant death. So what evolved was not a mind optimized for accuracy, but a mind optimized for belonging. That code is still running. This is why emotion comes before reasoning. The brain first asks a silent question. Does this threaten my identity, my tribe, my sense of safety? Only after answering that does it generate explanations that sound rational. This isn't conscious dishonesty. It's cognitive efficiency. Deep thinking costs energy. Revising beliefs creates internal conflict. Admitting error destabilizes identity. The average mind avoids these states the same way it avoids physical pain. Schopenhauer understood that expecting universal rationality is a diagnostic error. You are not surrounded by dormant thinkers waiting for the right explanation. You are surrounded by defensive systems trained to preserve what already feels true. When you present logic, the other person doesn't engage with the argument. They scan for threat. If your idea destabilizes who they believe themselves to be, the conversation ends, even if words continue. This is why conviction is often mistaken for intelligence. Why confidence feels persuasive. Why volume replaces depth. A limited mind cannot recognize its own limits, because that recognition would require the very capacity it lacks. So certainty fills the gap. Modern environments amplify this pattern. Social platforms reward speed, not reflection. Simple opinions travel farther than precise ones. Emotion outperforms nuance every time. Over time, thinking deeply becomes a disadvantage in public spaces. And that's where you start to feel out of place. Not because you are superior, but because you operate with abstraction, ambiguity, and delayed judgment, traits that are statistically rare. The problem was never communication. It was compatibility. And once you see that clearly, the frustration stops being confusing. It becomes predictable, which leads to a far more uncomfortable realization. What happens if nothing changes? There is a quiet cost to ignoring all of this, and it doesn't arrive suddenly. It accumulates. Every time you treat cognitive limits as a communication problem, you absorb the friction yourself. You explain again. You soften the idea. You reduce the depth. Not to be clear, but to be tolerated. Over time, this reshapes you. You start questioning your own clarity, not because it's wrong, but because resistance is constant. You leave conversations feeling drained, not challenged. You walk away more tired than when you entered. This is the dangerous part. People who think deeply but don't recognize this pattern begin to live below their capacity. They adapt downward. They avoid certain topics. They simplify ideas that were never meant to be simple. They choose silence, not as wisdom, but as fatigue. Eventually, this becomes a form of quiet self. Schopenhauer warned that arguing with limitation is a losing battle, not because the other side wins, but because you always pay the price. Each pointless debate costs clarity. Each attempt to persuade the emotionally closed costs focus. You don't leave those exchanges sharper. You leave compromise. The real threat isn't being misunderstood. It's reshaping yourself to avoid being misunderstood. When that happens, something essential erodes. Respect for your own perception. You begin trading truth for smoothness, precision for peace, depth for acceptance. If nothing changes, the outcome is predictable. Your environment slowly trains you to think less, not more. You find yourself surrounded by shallow consensus and repetitive conversations. Not because that's your level, but because it's the dominant one. And dominance shapes behavior. This is the alarming discovery. Failing to acknowledge cognitive limits in others isn't kindness. It's negligence toward yourself. And negligence always charges interest in the form of chronic frustration, quiet resentment, or a sense of isolation you never consciously chose. Achisami points, you realize that continuing this way isn't neutral. It's a decision, and every decision has a cost. This is where the real conflict begins. Not with others, but within you. On one side, there is discipline. The discipline of clarity, of restraint, of choosing silence over explanation when explanation serves no purpose. On the other side, there is comfort, the comfort of blending in, of simplifying what you know, of avoiding the quiet tension that comes with being misunderstood. Most people don't lose themselves in one dramatic moment. They erode slowly. At first, it feels practically. You choose easier conversations. You phrase ideas in ways that feel safer. You remove edges, then nuance, then depth. Not because you've changed your mind, but because resistance is exhausting. The mind learns quickly. It notices that thinking less creates less friction. That agreement is rewarded more than accuracy. That silence keeps things smooth, so it adapts. Schopenhauer observed that most people abandon truth not because they reject it, but because it demands too much effort. Comfort always feels cheaper in the moment, and the modern world magnifies this pressure. Everything is fast, reactive, opinionated. There is no reward for patience, no space for pause. So the struggle intensifies. You begin to sense a split. Who you are internally versus how you operate externally. What you see clearly versus what you allow yourself to say. This is the escalation when adaptation starts to look like survival, and survival starts to look like self-betrayal. The line between strategic restraint and quiet conformity becomes thin, and many cross it without noticing, not because they're weak, but because they're tired. This is the moment where most people surrender depth for peace. Not consciously, incrementally, and once that becomes habit, the mind settles into a lower baseline. What was once clarity now feels like friction. What was once precision now feels unnecessary. The question is no longer, why don't they understand? The question becomes, how much of myself am I willing to reduce to keep things easy? Because every time comfort wins over clarity, something stabilizes. And whatever stabilizes today becomes your default tomorrow. This is the point where a different choice becomes necessary. The way forward is not isolation, and it is not crusade. It is precision. Schopenhauer never argued for despising people. He argued for conserving energy, for understanding where effort produces growth and where it only produces noise. The first adjustment is internal. You stop demanding depth from minds that cannot sustain it, not as an insult, as a fact. You don't explain calculus to someone who hasn't learned arithmetic. You don't offer nuance to someone who only processes extremes. You adjust the level of engagement without adjusting who you are. The second adjustment is strategic. You reserve your depth. Real intelligence is expansive. It costs attention, discipline, and solitude. Spend it where it compounds, in study, in silence, in the few conversations that sharpen rather than drain you. Most people do not need your full clarity. They only need what allows interaction to function. And once you accept that, something loosens. The third adjustment is emotional. You release the need to convince. When you stop trying to change minds that were never built to change, the mind becomes quieter. You no longer measure yourself by agreement. You no longer seek validation from those incapable of offering accurate judgment. This does not create loneliness. It creates alignment. Schopenhauer understood that peace does not come from correcting the world, but from seeing it without illusion. Once you accept cognitive limits as part of the terrain, you stop fighting ghosts. You say less. You observe more. You choose your battles carefully. You engage deeply with those who can meet you and operate simply with those who cannot. This is not cynicism. It is cognitive maturity. It is the difference between frustration and effectiveness, between exhaustion and quiet authority. You stop waiting for people to rise to your level. You stop suffering from expectations that were never realistic. You begin operating within reality, not the version you were taught to hope for. That is where clarity lives. And if you've stayed with this until the end, you already understand the core of it, to mark that understanding. And so I know you truly walk this path with me. Write the word clarity in the comments. That is the signal not of superiority, but of seeing clearly and choosing to move accordingly.